Hold on 1 second here, because I'm trying to minimize something and also trying to figure out how to go back. All right, hold on. Okay, well, we can start here. I haven't really missed any slides. So anyway, thanks everybody for coming today. I think most of you have probably listened in on the first round that we did for all of your employees. And what we're going to do today is really just kind of build on that. And we're going to talk in a little bit more detail about the social and the legal climate concerning harassment. There's a lot going on in the social and legal climate concerning a lot of things lately, but we're going to be focusing more on the harassing piece. And I want to talk to all of you as supervisors as far as your responsibility to be out there recognizing what might potentially be inappropriate behavior, and certainly recognizing what is actually considered illegal. And we're also going to talk about your responsibility to take action with that. So it's not okay to hear something going on and just walk away from it and say, I'm just going to hope it goes away, because it usually doesn't. And it is your responsibility in a supervisory role to be addressing these things as they come up. We're also going to talk a little bit about what happens if something escalates to the point where there has to be an actual harassment investigation and what your role might be in that. And we'll talk about your role as far as non-retaliation, because as a supervisor, retaliation is something that is certainly in your hands. And then we're also going to have some case studies, and this is where I'm hoping that you're all going to be brave and be able to raise your hand and unmute yourselves, and we can get some discussion going on some of these things. So as a reminder, kind of a refresher of what was talked about with all of the employees, we talked about, social dynamics, what's going on out there socially. We've got different ages out there in the workplace that look at things very differently. We've got a lot of legislative enhancements that have gone on, particularly on a state level. So the laws have become more stringent concerning harassment. Social media is just there to fan the flames. That only makes anything that goes on regarding workplace harassment usually becomes worse and kind of goes viral out on social media. And there's also a lot more employee education going on out there. Just look at what ECI is doing. The state of Vermont does not require you to do anti-harassment training, but you've taken it on yourselves to say, you know what, this is important. We're going to go ahead and we're going to do it anyway. So your employees now are have a heightened awareness of what's acceptable in the workplace, certainly what's illegal in the workplace, and what some of their protections are under the law. So you combine all of that, and you've got employees that are keenly aware of workplace behavior, and they're expecting a higher standard of professionalism in the workplace. And employees are kind of empowered lately to do something about it. Gone are the days when we would sit there and let it happen because we were afraid of losing our jobs. They know that they've got protections. So it's all that much more important for you as supervisors to make sure that this kind of behavior isn't happening, because it's not going to go unnoticed anymore. In 2018, as we had mentioned earlier, there have been some enhancements to sexual harassment, in particular to compliance laws. The sexual harassment laws now protect anyone that's been hired to do any work for ECI, and that includes your vendors, it includes your independent contractors. So we're not just talking about protecting your employees from sexual harassment, we're talking about protecting your employees from anyone who could potentially be harassing them in the workplace. And you also have a certain responsibility to be preventing your employees from harassing any vendors or independent contractors. And even though this law specifically applies to sexual harassment, harassment policy in your handbook says that everything that applies to sexual harassment also applies to discriminatory harassment. So by saying that in your handbook, you're basically elevating any claim of harassment to the same standard as the state holds sexual harassment to. the state has also made it a lot easier to file a harassment claim with the Attorney General's office. It's very easy to go online. If you ever were inclined to check it out, you can go online to the Vermont Attorney General's office, and with a couple of clicks, you can fill in information and hit send, and you filed a complaint. So it's really easy for employees. If they feel like their concerns aren't being addressed internally, they're not going to think twice about going out to the Attorney General's office. And the new law also now allows the Vermont Attorney General's office to actually come on site to do compliance visits. They've admitted that they're not just going to randomly pick a company and go out there and check for their policy and how they enforce their policies. But if there's a complaint, they may very well do that, and they can, and that's new. So if you've got anything inappropriate going on in the workplace, somebody files a claim, you may very well be contacted by the Attorney General's office saying, let's schedule a time. We're going to come in and we're going to talk about what you do to prevent harassment in your workplace. And you never really want to go there. So I took a look, I went and found some EEOC statistics. Now, EEOC is the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, and that's basically the federal office that will take harassment complaints, as opposed to the Vermont Attorney General's office, which takes them on a state level. So employees can complain to either entity. And that's in your harassment policy. The state says that you need to list all the contact information for both the EEOC and for the Vermont Attorney General's office. So again, it's become easier for an employee to file a complaint. So I couldn't find any stats on the Vermont Attorney General's office site, but on the EEOC, I took a look at 2019 information of discrimination charges and what's prominent, what's out there. And what really struck me is how many claims of retaliation there are out there. And that would be retaliation for either filing a complaint or for participating in an investigation. There are a lot of complaints out there for discrimination based on a disability. Race is up there at 33%, sex is up there at 32.4%, and age is up there at 21.4%. All the other categories it really dropped off after age. With all of those, remember those protected classes? All of them were included, but these were the big heavy hitters. And you'll notice that they add up to more than 100% because when a charge is filed, it's usually not just I'm filing a charge on disability or I'm filing a charge on retaliation. They usually pack a number of different charges into one charge. And it can get really, really expensive. The benefits to employees who have filed charges in 2019 came out to $139.6 million. That's a lot of money. Again, retaliation is something that you as a supervisor have in your control. So it's really, really important that you keep in mind what your role is there, that if you have been dealing with any kind of a discriminatory harassment issue or a discrimination issue, how you respond to that is really going to be key, and it's going to be looked at with a microscope. So important to know. So I'm always encouraging to go beyond what the law says that you have to do and really implement some good best practices. One of them is to conduct sexual harassment training, which you're doing. So you're on board with that. I also like to see the dissemination of the policy go farther than just including it in your employee handbook. So the state of Vermont says that you do need to disseminate your anti-harassment policy, but my recommendation is always that you actually have a separate copy of it. You have it in the handbook, and you also have a separate copy that your new employees acknowledge when they come on board. And it's probably not a bad idea to have employees acknowledging it once a year. What some employers have done is they've incorporated it into their open enrollment process. So at the end of your harassment policy, there's usually some sort of an acknowledgement form. You can load that policy into whatever system that you use for your employees to enroll in their benefits. And while they're at it, they can acknowledge that they've taken a look at the anti-harassment policy. It's a good practice to go over it in staff meetings. You know, maybe once a year, mark it on your calendar. Okay, we need to review our harassment policy so that everybody has it fresh in their mind. I also think it's a good idea if you have your vendors and your contractors actually acknowledge your harassment policy. A lot of organizations, and you may have done this, now incorporate that into their standard contract. What's really, really important, and this sounds like a no-brainer, but you would be surprised, is whatever procedures you have out there to follow in the event of a harassment claim, you need to follow them. There are a lot of companies out there who just panic when they get some sort of a complaint. They don't know what to do. And they come to me and say, well, what do I do? And the first thing I do is say, well, what does your policy say? And they're like, oh yeah, we do have a policy. So it is important to remember that that policy is out there and refer to it. It's a living document. And then, you know, really the best thing that you can do is you just make it a part of your everyday culture. Because if you're living if you are living with respect and you are exhibiting respect, your employees are much more likely to follow suit. So I had touched on 4 policies that are in your handbook that really do hit on basically not just non-harassing behavior, but on appropriate conduct in the workplace. These are the 4 policies that will touch on that. So we're going to dig a little bit deeper here. You've got a section that says philosophy, and that makes it really, really clear that all of your employees need to look and behave professionally. And it also says that you're expecting all of your workers to treat each other, to treat clients, and to treat the public with respect. So again, it's out there, it's in your handbook. I think it is up to you as managers and supervisors to remind people of that if you see things kind of falling off the rails a little bit. You've also got a company use, company electronic devices, and internet use policy. And what that basically says is that all of those company policies that are in your policy manuals and in your handbook, that they apply to using the internet and all technology systems as well. So any kind of harassing behavior, your anti-harassment policy, if there's harassing that's going on online, that also falls under your anti-harassment policy. You've got your non-discrimination and harassment policy, which again, I'm not sure if that new one has been distributed yet, but this is the one that really lays out what's acceptable, what's not acceptable. It's very detailed. It has examples of inappropriate behavior. It has contact information for who in the organization needs to be contacted if there is any kind of harassing behavior going on. It talks very specifically about anti-retaliation protections for employees. And as I mentioned before, it also gives all of the contact information for both the EEOC and the Attorney General's office. So employees should be well informed as to what their rights are. This really lays out for them what the policy says and what the implications are if it's not followed. And you know, just as a reminder, the behavior that's going on in the workplace doesn't need to rise to that level of illegal harassment in order to warrant your action. If it's inappropriate, if it's falling outside of the realm of what you would consider appropriate conduct, take care of it. You can certainly do something about it. You don't sit back and wait until you think, oh, I think this might actually be illegal behavior. If it doesn't fall within the parameters of what you consider acceptable, address it, because the sooner that you nip it in the bud, the less likely it is to escalate to something that could actually be getting you into some legal trouble. And then you have a code of conduct. And what that does, that one really sets the expectation for how you expect your employees to be behaving. And in particular, it says that you want them to strive to maintain a positive and professional image of ECI to our employers, our clients, vendors, subcontractors, and the public. And it specifically says that you expect them to maintain respectful behavior whenever one is working, driving a company vehicle, or wearing the company logo. So it's pretty pretty broad and pretty all-encompassing. So do we have any questions up until this point?
I don't believe so. No one in the chat and no one has raised their hand yet.
Okay, we'll keep going then. So there are a lot of different areas of what you do that's going to be covered by anti-discrimination and anti-harassment policies and laws. One of them is your hiring process. So when you're hiring a new employee, you're interviewing them, you're making those hiring decisions, you always have to keep in mind that those anti-discrimination pieces hold true for that as well. So you kind of have to look at all your practices, look at your hiring practices, who are you hiring, and kind of look at it through what I call that discriminatory lens. Make sure that you're not inadvertently only hiring men when you have equally qualified women, or only hiring young people when you might have somebody who's in their 50s who is equally as qualified, and you're saying, I don't know, they might be retiring soon. That could be a problem. So kind of take a look at your decisions and think, how would somebody potentially be viewing this, even if it's not your intent? Remember, it's really perception, because perception can become reality, even if it's not your intent. Take a look at, your promotions and your transfers. When you're making a promotion decision, make sure that you're looking at all and taking a look at, could this be construed at all as discriminatory in nature? Same with your performance reviews. Any kind of recognition programs that you do, bonuses that you pay out, same thing. In general, the work environment. Is everybody being treated on a par? When you're selecting people to be trained, maybe they're getting special training because you're kind of grooming them for the next level. Take a look at who you're doing it for. And obviously terminations, you always need to be looking at them with that discriminatory lens as well. It doesn't mean that you can't terminate somebody who, say, for example, is, say it's an older person. It doesn't mean that you can't terminate them just because they're a member of a protected class. But what it does mean is you probably need to take a look at it a little bit more carefully than if you were terminating somebody in their 20s. And say, are we sure that we're doing this based on objective job criteria and behavioral criteria? And do we have this well documented? Again, you don't want to create that perception. So this is a slide that I had used in the general training, taking a look at your workforce as a whole. And again, I generalize when it comes to these breakdowns of age. It is a generalization, but I think most of us who are in that baby boomer category, we realize that we look at things very, very differently than somebody who is 20 years old might look at things. And in your workforce in particular, you are, and it's no surprise, it's nothing that you've done wrong, but you are very heavy on men versus women. Again, nothing unusual about that. It will probably, over the next couple of years, start changing, but it's something to be aware of, because it can very easily, workplace conversations can digress maybe into conversations among workers that maybe are disparaging towards women, because it's guy talk, right? It can happen. And on the flip side, I have seen that happen the opposite way too, where you've got women who bond together and they do their girl talk, and it might make someone who is male feel uncomfortable. So it does go both ways. I do understand that. And if you take a look at your actual management staff, and this is what I wanted you to see, you've got a decent number of baby boomers in management, which again isn't unusual because your managers are the ones that have usually been around the longest. So it does tend to be that older demographic. But you've also got a lot of millennials in your supervisor ranks. And again, the thought processes can be very, very different from the 55 and older group to the 22 to 37-year-old group. So you just kind of have to be aware of the fact that there are a lot of different viewpoints represented, even in your management group. And again, very, very top heavy on men. So just something to keep in mind, that you need to be kind of hyper aware of the fact that your females aren't very well represented in your management ranks. Again, it doesn't mean that there's any discrimination going on there. It's kind of the nature of construction. Nothing wrong with it, but you have to be aware of it and make sure that the actions that you're taking don't inadvertently favor the men over the women. And then you've got what we call Gen Z coming into the workplace, and you probably have these. These are the really young ones. These are your, 16, 17-year-olds to 22 or 23, somewhere in around there. And these are the people who really, they were basically born with a smartphone in their hand, right? They have been totally raised on social media. It's a way of life for them. They are hyper aware of bullying behavior. They're getting all sorts of classes and discussions that go on in school about bullying that certainly didn't happen when I was in school. So they're really aware of what potential bullying could be and what that looks like. And they've been told that if this is going on, it's not only wrong, but you need to stand up for it. You have rights. You need to let people know that it's not okay to be treating you that way. So that's the mindset that they have, as opposed to maybe some older people in the workplace might be thinking a little bit more along the lines of, well, you know what, that's just the way it's always been. Or, you know what, that's just John being John. It's really not that big of a deal. But what you don't think is a big deal could be a very big deal, particularly to someone who's younger. And remember, too, that, with the being a little bit younger, there's a little bit more of a lack of discretion. And a little bit more impulsivity. So they're going to be much more likely to react if something inappropriate is going on as well. And you've got a lot going on with your workforce. It's become very, very different. When I entered the workforce 30-something years ago, it was very male dominated. It was assumed that if you were having a baby, the first question out of anybody's mouth was, oh, are you going to stay home? And if you said, no, I'm coming back to work, you kind of got looked at like, what? So times have changed. You've got a lot of single parent families, and that's not just female heads of household, it's male heads of household too, right? You've got same-sex parents. Single person households make up almost 27% of all households. I mean, that's a lot. You've got a lot more households where you've got couples that aren't married. And with all of these different family dynamics, you tend to have very different viewpoints all feeding in. So the point really is that a lot of people, there's a lot more diversity in thinking out there in your workplace than there used to be. So with all of those differences come a lot of different perspectives, right? So if you take a look at this, you've got one, if you look at it from one angle, it looks like there are 4 rods. If you look at it from the other angle, there are very clearly only 3, right? Is either one right or wrong? No. Either one could be right, either one could be wrong. But it all depends on how you're looking at it. So you could have a situation arise in the workplace, and one person could be saying, well, that's not a big deal. Why is anybody getting offended over that? And another person could be saying, I can't believe that somebody just said that. That's horrible. That's offensive. That's discriminatory. 2 very different responses to the same situation. And it's really important to understand that just because you're looking at it one way doesn't mean other people are going to look at it the same way. And it doesn't mean that somebody else's perspective is necessarily wrong. So if you ever are in a position where you've got somebody coming to you and complaining about somebody's inappropriate behavior, first reaction can't be, really? I can't believe you find that offensive. You really need to keep an open mind and understand that even if you don't necessarily agree that that behavior is offensive, you need to understand that this person's perception of it is very real. So how to go about spotting harassment? Hopefully it's not going on in the first place. But what I want you to be aware of as supervisors is that an employee doesn't actually have to file a complaint in order for it to be considered harassing behavior. According to the law, and again, I'm not an employment attorney, but I certainly do listen to a lot of them. What the law basically says is that the company is liable if it either knew or should have known that harassing behavior was taking place in the workplace. So if you're if you're somebody who you're on a work site and you just generally don't ever go out and walk around, so you don't really know what's going on, you're just assuming everything is okay, and you're not out there and you're just kind of ignoring anything that might potentially be inappropriate, you don't have to wait for an employee to actually be filing a complaint. If it comes out that you either knew, or if you weren't aware, I can't believe you were that oblivious, you should have known about it, that's enough to make ECI liable. So it really is your responsibility to know what's going on out there in the workplace and to put a stop to it if it is in any way could be construed as inappropriate, because it will come back to bite you. It's not good enough to say, oh, nobody filed a complaint, it couldn't have been that bad. So it's really important to get out there and be paying attention to not only what's being said to you, but pay attention to how your staff is interacting. How are they talking to each other? How are they treating each other? Are they upholding those standards of behavior, those standards of professionalism and respect? Talk to your people. Let them know that you're there and that you are listening, that you're listening to them and that you're aware of what's going on out there. It's really important to get out there and just walk around. It's not okay to be sitting in an office all the time and never getting out there and seeing what's going on with the people that fall under your responsibility. And again, take any kind of complaints that you get, you have to take it seriously. Even if it's coming from somebody that you know is, we all have this, the chronic complainer, right? You always have to take it seriously, because you never know when that one complaint, kind of like the boy who cried wolf, right? You never know when you're going to get that one complaint that really is a problem. And not only that, your harassment policy says that you're going to be looking into any potential inappropriate conduct. So you do have that obligation to do that. It's also your responsibility as a supervisor to, if you see any kind of potentially harassing situations going on out there in the workplace, the important thing initially is to diffuse it. Don't walk away from it. Make sure that it stops. And then if it's appropriate after that, pull somebody aside and say, I want to talk about what I heard you say. I don't think that's okay, and here's why. And I don't expect it to happen again. So really, there's kind of two steps there. Actually diffusing it in the moment to make sure that it's not continuing, and then addressing it to make sure that it doesn't happen again. And I can't emphasize enough the importance of not avoiding difficult conversations. It's really, really hard, especially if you're somebody who hasn't been in a supervisory role for very long, or maybe you've recently been made a supervisor over people who used to be your coworkers. It's really, really hard to sometimes have those tough conversations, but it comes with the territory. You've got support. You don't have to do it alone. You can always go to your manager and get some guidance about how to handle particular situations. But the worst thing that you could do is avoid them. And that's not only regarding harassment, it's regarding work performance as well. So don't be afraid to ask questions and to ask for help if you're really not sure how to handle a particular situation. Anything serious comes up, Ben, Matt, you know where to find me. You can always call me and run it by me. You've got a support network. You don't need to go it alone. So things that you should be particularly on the lookout for, obviously you should be listening to what people say and how they talk to each other. And is there any kind of dialogue that is potentially unwelcome? Kind of physical contact is generally not acceptable in the workplace anymore. Any kind of putting your arms on somebody's shoulders, most people are saying, no, that's not okay. That doesn't belong in the workplace. Body language, glances, looks. How do you look at somebody? Obviously, if there's any kind of a display of sexually suggested objects, any kind of pictures out there, and that includes, anything that somebody might be looking at on their phone, right? Like two employees looking at some sort of a sexually inappropriate joke on a cell phone. It's something that you should be kind of on the lookout for. It's not that you have to go out there and look for it, because hopefully it's not happening, but you never know. Any kinds of pranks or jokes. And this is really a tough one, because, you want to have an atmosphere where everybody has a certain element of fun, right? And where people are comfortable with each other and they're comfortable joking around with each other. But it's kind of important to know what the limits are. And it's also important that if one of your employees says, that's enough, you're crossing a line, that's respected, that it's respected by the employees who maybe were engaging in those pranks or jokes. And it's important that if you see that somebody's had enough, that you step in and say, you know what, it's going a little bit too far. But that's kind of a tough one, because it is sort of a fine line. And again, you don't always know how somebody's reacting to it, because not everybody is going to be forthcoming and letting you know that it's not okay. Any kind of bantering that's going on that could potentially be disparaging anybody that's in a protected class. That's something to be aware of, because sometimes just that verbal bantering, even if it's not directed towards anybody in particular, if you've got a couple of employees and they're bantering back and forth, maybe they're disparaging the Black Lives Matter movement, and some people could be taking offense to that. So these are things that, they could be very innocent, but you need to kind of be aware of it. Basically any kind of conduct out there that isn't going to fall in line with those policies that we went over, that's kind of regulating what you want your behavior to be. So I'm going to ask you to unmute on this one. Take a look at this picture. What do we think? Do we think this is inappropriate behavior? Do we think it's potentially harassment? What do we think? Ooh, okay.
I'll jump in. Inappropriate behavior that could lead to potential harassment.
Okay. What are your clues there? What's going on?
I would say that it could be inappropriate touching.
Yeah.
By the male. I'm guessing that's a male in the back.
Yep.
Right.
Behind the woman.
The other person looks uneasy too in the picture.
Absolutely. Right. Absolutely. And notice that the hands aren't on her, but it's still making her pretty uncomfortable, right? What do you think's going through her mind?
This is not good.
That's right.
I hope I'm not next.
Yes, absolutely. She's thinking, I hope I'm not next. I hope this person isn't going to come and do that to me next. But it's a really good example of the behavior doesn't necessarily have to be levied on you in order for it to be starting to potentially cross over that realm of a hostile work environment. Because one of the definitions of that, if you think back to what we've talked about in previous sessions, is if it's interfering with somebody's ability to do their job, it could be considered a hostile work environment. And if you take a look at the girl there in the blue shirt, her eyes are definitely not on her work, right? I would say that what's going on with the person next to her is a distraction. So if it happens once, it's probably not going to reach that level of illegal harassment. But if this is going on all the time, absolutely, it could be.
If they're not able to do anything about it, or they don't, it's training the person that with the hands there that it's okay.
Right, right. So this is the kind of thing that, as a supervisor, if you're out and you're walking around and you see this, what could you do?
So I just unmuted everybody. So if anyone wants to jump in, feel free.
I
Should you
think
make,
you'd want to talk to the aggressor about it, but maybe not in front of those two, and maybe talk to those two or separately and just say, hey, what was going on there? How did that make you feel? And if, the person being touched was like, oh yeah, no, me and him are pretty like close, and be like, okay, you need to keep that outside of work. And if it's like, I felt really, felt really vulnerable and compromised, and it's like, all right, we need to deal with this.
yeah.
I don't think
I
I'd deal with it right there and then though.
Yeah, no, I agree. I agree that it's, what you can always do is some sort of a distraction, right? Think of something to say um, that will kind of diffuse the whole situation, right? How can you go in there and change the topic? What can you start talking about that might cause that person to back off, right? Just come in and interrupt whatever's going on, and that might diffuse it in the moment. But I do think 2 points that you made, it is important to talk to the person whose hands are on the shoulder and to tell them, that's the kind of behavior that not everybody is going to take kindly to. So it really doesn't belong here. And then talk to those two women separately too and say, I noticed this. I don't think it's okay. We're addressing it. Just let me know if it bothers you and if it's continuing to happen, so that they know they're being supported.
In a lot of cases, Susan, if you make eye contact with the guy doing it, they'll stop.
You're probably right. And again, it could be very innocent, and it could also be misinterpreted. I mean, if you look at these two girls' faces, I don't think either one of them looks happy. I think that's pretty obvious. But it's not always so dry. Like you said, that woman could be saying, we grew up next door to each other, and he's like a brother to me. That doesn't bother me. So you don't know, but I think it is important to find out and to make sure that they know that they're supported. And if they're saying, no, I'm not comfortable with this, and to be perceptive enough to take a look at the looks on their faces and say, yeah, I don't think this is welcome. So yeah, good points. Thank you. So what do you do if you actually get an employee complaint? Because you're a supervisor, right? It could happen. Is anybody else a Michael Scott fan, right? World's best boss. That's what we all want to be. So I think it's important if somebody does come to you and say, you know what, I'm having an issue. I've got a problem. There's behavior going on I'm not comfortable with. Listening without judgment, as we mentioned before, is really important. Even if it's somebody that for some reason doesn't have a whole lot of credibility in your eyes, right? It's also important to do it in a private location, which sometimes is difficult, particularly if you're out there and you're on a work site. You can't always have somebody come into a conference room or into an office and close the door, but you can certainly move the conversation away from where it would be within earshot of other people. Because you don't want other people to be hearing this. You want this person to be talking to you openly and honestly. And if they think somebody else is listening, they're not going to do it. And they might be less comfortable doing it if they think other people can see as well. It kind of depends on the situation. I don't think there's anything wrong with taking notes. If you need to do that in order to remember details, if you're anything like me, I may not remember an hour from now what somebody said to me if I hadn't necessarily written it down. So if you're in a location, if you're in a position where you can take some notes, I think it's fine to do that. I also think it's important to say to the person who is coming to you, you know what, I'm just going to take some notes so that I'm sure that I'm clear when I go back to refer to this. So that otherwise, if you just start writing things down, it immediately causes that other person to shut down. I would also let that person know that you're going to be reaching out to somebody else about what happened. And this is important because, again, remember, think back to that you either knew or should have known. As soon as somebody comes to you with a complaint, right? And that means that you need to be doing something about it. So you can't just send them on their way and say, well, you know what, let's just wait and see if this happens again. You do need to take action. You also don't need to take action alone. So again, you can go to Ben, you can go to Matt, and figure out what the appropriate next step would be. And by all means, use your discretion with who you discuss this with. Only discuss it with people who need to know. If you're not sure what to do, don't go to one of your coworkers and say, you wouldn't believe what so-and-so just told me. What do you think I should do? You really need to use your discretion here because, again, the policy says that you're going to keep it confidential to the extent possible. So by discussing it with people who don't need to know, that's not following the spirit of that part of your policy. So again, go to Matt, go to Ben, talk it through. If they're not sure what to do with it, they're either going to call me if it's a really egregious complaint. Legal counsel will probably be involved, but you don't have to go it alone. So again, regarding an actual formal investigation, if it's something that's serious enough or repetitive enough that you really need to go that investigation role, just know that ECI is obligated to be looking into these complaints, and in a lot of cases, it does warrant an actual formal investigation. And again, that's outlined in your policy. You may have an attorney involved in this. They may be directly involved, or they may just be providing guidance to whoever on your staff is going to be designated as the person who's going to be running the investigation. Usually it's HR. I know right now you're kind of missing an HR person, but there probably will be someone there who would be in charge of the investigation. There's going to be talking to witnesses. So, one of the questions that's always asked, and I'm not going to go into detail, I could talk for an hour about how to conduct an investigation, but there's going to be information gathered from anybody who may have witnessed the occurrence. All of that information needs to be very, very clearly documented because that's all something that could potentially end up in a court of law if this thing isn't resolved there and the employee decides to take it further. So really, really important to have good documentation, not only from a legal standpoint, but good documentation to refer back to. If something else comes up a couple of months from now, you're not necessarily going to remember what happened 6 months ago or even a year ago. You do need to circle back to the complainant and inform them of the outcome. Now, by informing them of the outcome, that doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to go back to the person who filed the complaint and say, we found so-and-so guilty and they've been put on a final warning, and if it happens again, they're going to lose their job. No, you don't need to go that far. But what you do need to do is say to the complainant, we have conducted an investigation, we've gathered as much information as we could, and we either found out that harassing behavior did happen, or it didn't happen, or we just didn't have enough to make that determination. But reassure them that they should come to you if it continues to happen, because their safety is your priority, and that they need to come to you if it continues, if it happens again. So you do need to circle back, and I would say to do it in a timely manner. Now, it doesn't, sometimes investigations can take a while to pull together, but it should be happening really pretty quickly. Like within a week or two is kind of the general time frame that I like to go with. It really shouldn't be, no matter how busy anybody is, it really shouldn't be going any longer than that unless it has to, because, for example, people that you need to talk to aren't available for whatever reason. And it's also important to circle back not only to the complainant, but to anyone who's taking part in the investigation and reiterate to them that they're protected from any kind of retaliation for either taking part in the investigation, or if they're the one that filed the complaint, they are protected against any kind of retaliatory action as well. Just remind them of that. Again, think back to how many complaints with the EEOC were centered on retaliation. I get the question all the time of, well, what disciplinary action should we be taking? And the answer is, now I'm really going to sound like an attorney, well, it depends. So it's going to vary. It's going to depend on how serious the situation was. Is it repetitive? Was it a one-time thing that happened and it's not going to, you've addressed it and it's not going to happen, it hasn't shown signs that it's going to happen again? It really just depends. You might be talking to an attorney about what to do. Again, kind of depending on the outcome, on how egregious the accusations are. So what your policy is very clear on is that disciplinary action is up to and including termination of employment. It's really broad, but it's there so that you as an organization have flexibility to make the punishment fit the crime. You don't want to rope yourself into, if this happens, then this is what the punishment's going to be. Every case is going to be different. You're never going to find two identical situations. So just going over in a little bit more detail, what would be considered retaliation? It's basically any kind of adverse action against someone that could potentially be construed as retaliatory for either participating in an investigation or for bringing a claim to management's attention. And again, it is unlawful, it's prohibited to be taking any kind of retaliatory action against someone. And that's where you don't have to be afraid if you've got an issue, a work performance issue with someone who had filed a harassment complaint. That doesn't mean that you can't address the work performance issue. But what it does mean is you really have to look at it and think, how is this going to look? And if I'm going to be taking some sort of adverse action because of work performance, I better make sure that I've got all of my I's dotted and my T's crossed so that it's very clearly linked to their job performance and not to the harassment complaint. So all of these things that are in your control, like adverse employment action, reassigning somebody, giving them a poor performance review, all of these things are in your control as a supervisor or a manager. So that retaliation piece is something to be keenly aware of, because retaliation only happens from a supervisor. Again, examples, this is a little bit redundant. It's, if you're treating them any differently because you're retaliating, because you're looking at them differently, maybe they filed the complaint against you, which can be a really, really difficult situation, right? Then you have to be really, really careful that you're not, that component isn't entering into how you treat this employee at all, that you're not more closely scrutinizing their work because of the complaint that they filed. And you're not making their work any more difficult because of the complaint that they filed. So harassment has a ripple effect, and it really kind of penetrates into all parts of your organization. Obviously, if you've got any kind of inappropriate behavior going on in the workplace, or anything that's really less than respectful behavior going on in the workplace, it starts getting uncomfortable for other workers really, really fast. And when workers start getting uncomfortable and they're not happy with their work, what do? They're not very productive. They also tend to leave, right? And I can guarantee you it's the ones that you don't want leaving that are going to be the first ones out the door. So you're going to lose. Morale can sink down into the toilet really, really fast when you've got inappropriate behavior going on. People talk. If they're not happy in their workplace, they're going to go out and they're going to talk to their friends about, I'm looking for another job because I just can't stand it at DCI. You wouldn't believe what goes on there, right? And next thing you know, you're having a harder time recruiting because your reputation is getting out there and people are saying, I don't think I want to go there, right? And it can really hit you in the pocketbook as well, because if you get one charge, the first thing that you're going to have to do is hire an attorney. And that gets really, really expensive. The time that you have to put into conducting investigations and potentially defending legal action if it really escalates, a real inordinate amount of time and effort on management's part as well. And, it definitely filters out in the community. We live in Vermont. Everybody knows everything about everybody else, right? If you've got a reputation of having a workplace that isn't a really nice place to work, a lot of people are going to know about it. And it will definitely affect your ability to recruit. It might affect your ability to effectively service your customers, right? They might not come to you to do a job because they're like, yeah, you know what, I hear about them, it's just, I've heard, did you hear about that lawsuit that, and how they treated that employee? Why do we want to have them doing work for us? So it happens really quickly. I can guarantee you that if you had an egregious harassment charge, it would probably make the front page of the Free Press and it would be all over the place. So, you know, it's Vermont. It is what it is. You can't hide. So do we have any questions up until this point?
I don't believe so. Again, I got everybody unmuted, so you have your own control of your mic. So feel free to jump in, and if anybody does.
Well, I'm going to move on. Okay, go ahead.
I had a couple of things quick, and because I don't know at the end if we would talk about this, but as supervisors, when someone kind of accuses us of doing something that's inappropriate, I think a lot of people's tendency is to defend and prove them wrong, that we weren't intending that. But something that you said earlier made a lot of sense, is that you just got to understand that that's the way they took it. And I found that sometimes it's easier just to accept that and say, you know what, I'm sorry. And then that diffuses it. But I've seen, and I've been involved in some situations where people try to defend it, and it just makes everything worse.
Yeah.
So that was one comment that I had related to something that you said.
Now,
yeah.
I had a question. This is Phil Forster. You mentioned that if you had a situation with someone, to make sure that you don't scrutinize their work more as intensive. What's the word I'm looking for? You don't want to make sure you don't over scrutinize their work, but how do you keep from also just kind of letting them that you would normally not overlook with anyone, but in this case, to avoid any further conflict, you're kind of stepping back from that, which then also affects the morale of the rest of the group.
Yeah. I had a hard time hearing you, but I think I've gotten the gist of what you're saying. It's really important and also really hard to take any bias out of how you treat your employees. And that's a really hard thing to do, but it doesn't mean that you should be cutting them any breaks because of a previous incident or a complaint. But it does mean that you need to be kind of hyper aware of how could this be construed. And if you're closely scrutinizing their work, take a step back and say, do I have a real legitimate work reason for closely scrutinizing their work? Or is my bias starting to creep in? And I think that that's something that you can pretty much discern for yourself. And again, if you are closely scrutinizing their work, make sure that there's a reason for it, and a documented reason for it. Like you're scrutinizing it more closely because they made a couple of really costly errors in the last couple of weeks. There's nothing wrong with that. They shouldn't be permitted anything that another employee wouldn't be, just because you're afraid of the retaliation piece.
Can I add to that? Is to be consistent.
Yes.
Be very consistent.
And if you are consistent, one employee to the next, you should be okay. It's hard. It's really hard if you've got somebody that you are thinking in the back of your mind, that person doesn't like me, or that person is a troublemaker. It's really hard not to have that enter into how you treat them. But it's your job as a manager to do that. Do we have other questions? These are good questions. Thanks. Okay, so we're going to move on to the case studies. So again, it's going to depend on you all to jump in. So here's your first situation. You have a supervisor. He says, hey, Tom, how come you never join us for happy hour? And Tom says, I told you before, I'm just not interested in hanging out at a bar. the supervisor says, well, being antisocial is no way to move up around here. If you don't want to be stuck in this job forever, I'd suggest you start being social with us for a change. So what do we think? Do we think that that's appropriate on behalf of the supervisor? Do we think it's potential harassment? What do we think? Potential discrimination?
I'm not bailing anybody out. Someone step in.
I think it's inappropriate and potential discrimination.
Yeah, and why do you say that?
Well, just because he may have his reasons for not wanting to go to the bar, whether he's doing dry January or he's has some history in the past, for whatever reason, doesn't want to go and to limit his ability to move up in the company, shouldn't be based on after work activities.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, if it might be a little bit different if it wasn't coming from a supervisor, but it's coming from somebody who can influence where he goes in the company. A really good point is that person may have a very legitimate reason for not hanging out at a bar, right? What if he is an alcoholic in recovery? All of a sudden you've got a protected class in there, right? We talked about that earlier, that alcoholism is considered a disability. So then you could be disparaging someone because of their disability and treating them differently because of their disability. So yeah, this could snowball. And
I would definitely consider it harassment as well, because it's certainly not the first time it's come up. I mean, he asks him, he says no, and he also outlines the fact that he says, I've told you this before. So, I mean, the guy, it's a little beyond, an invitation. It's or way beyond an invitation. I would say he's harassing him, to the point of, come around or don't, or don't move up.
Right. And yeah, that's key. The fact that he said, I told you before. So this is repetitive. So it's kind of getting into that hostile work environment piece too, right? It's not just a one-off. This is happening all the time. So very, very good point. And the other thing that we've talked about in the earlier sessions is no means no, right? So if he has said before, no, I don't want to join you for happy hour, a more appropriate response would be, well, you know what? You're welcome to join us if you change your mind. And leave it at that, so that Tom knows that he's welcome, but there's nothing disparaging about it. You either join us or you don't. Okay, let's move on to another one here. You send one of your engineers who's a person of color to work on a project. You chose her because it's a project that will enhance her supervisory skills and potentially help her to advance within ECI. She complains that an employee of another company on the worksite has made disparaging racial comments to her, and she feels uncomfortable working there. So what do we think? What do you do in a situation like this? Is this potentially harassing?
Certainly, if she doesn't feel comfortable.
Yeah.
I mean, her subjectiveness aside, I mean, if the person's making racial comments, that's not good.
Right.
A talking to with the individual and the individual's boss, I think, would certainly be in order.
Yep. Now remember, that individual is not an ECI employee. Does that matter?
In the moment, I don't know if I would notice the difference. It's just a person treating another person not well, and I don't think that matters either, because we technically we're their employee, correct?
Yeah.
In this situation, yeah. So it's certainly within the boundaries.
Yeah. And I've had managers, when I've thrown this out with other trainings, say, yeah, but if that person doesn't work for us, how are we going to address it? And that's one of those it depends answers, but it's important to remember. What was that?
I said everybody's got a chain of command.
Yeah. And just because that person doesn't work for you, your responsibility is to make the harassment stop for your employee.
And to advocate for our employee.
Yep. Exactly. So it's important to make it stop, whether that person who's doing the harassing is your employee or not. And remember, that's also part of Vermont law now, that it doesn't matter whether that person's your employee or not. If your employee is being harassed on the work site, then it's your problem and you do need to be addressing it. I also had one manager once say, well, you know what, I would just take her off the job and send her to a different job. What would be the problem with that?
You're accepting their behavior.
Yeah, yep, that's part of it. The other piece is you put her on this job in the first place because it's something that's going to help to advance her career.
And also, you know about it too. So that
Yep.
means you know.
Yeah, absolutely.
And you're taking her off now you're taking her off the job. So that's like discrimination, right?
Mhm. Yeah, it's denying her the opportunity for a learning experience because she felt uncomfortable. So yeah, there were a lot of things wrong with that answer, but you'd be surprised the answers we get, but you're all on it. Any other comments on this one? Thoughts?
I know these are tough situations, and I think we run into micro versions of this every day of the week. And you know, we're always moving people around, and not everybody is going to be best buddies with everybody. And so sometimes there's just a chemistry or a personality, you know, clashes that we try to balance, and we try to make people comfortable, and there's doesn't really cross the boundaries that we realize into the harassment or discrimination phase. But I think there's certainly room to kind of add some more questions to the conversation before we do that, to make sure that we're not, you know, making one person happy, but unintentionally putting someone else into the bad position where they're maybe being moved to a lesser opportune job, or maybe being moved into an environment that's better, but not solving the problem where it started.
Exactly. So you really do need to address the underlying cause, not just try to put a patch on the situation. So, good comment. All right, let's try the next one. One of your supervisors informs you that he received a complaint from an employee that other employees were singling them out for identifying as queer. The supervisor spoke with the named offenders, one of whom admitted to using derogatory slurs. That offender felt badly and promised it wouldn't happen again. So do you think if this happened to you, you've had a supervisor come to you and explain this situation, what do you think you should do? Do you think there's any further action you should take? What do you think?
Just document the incident, maybe a low grade, not something super official, but something to say that it happened in the event that something does happen again. It can rear its, it can become germane or whatever.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, to write it down and make a note that it happened before, and it's not something official that you put into the quote unquote personnel file, just something for your own notes to refer back to if you hear of this happening again. So you'd be surprised how many times you think, oh, that happened like 5 or 6 months ago, and then you look at it and you're like, oh wow, that was a year ago. It just kind of helps to refresh your memory. Do you think that this warrants any additional follow-up?
Maybe some, if everybody's at a quorum, there's an understanding reached, probably not. But if there's, still some hurt feelings, maybe, I don't know if it's as egregious to like warrant an apology or something like that, but I mean, it certainly wouldn't hurt.
Right. Yeah, I think that's a good point. And again, every situation is a little bit different, and this is just 2 treetops to get into the personalities that are involved. But I think one more important piece would be to maybe go back to, maybe you and your supervisor go back to the employee and just reiterate to them that they spoke with the perpetrators, and the situation hopefully is going to stop, and it should stop. And to please let you know if it happens again. So, and I think this is just kind of reminding me of going back to when we were talking about conducting an investigation and circling back around to the person who originally filed the complaint. Another helpful hint that I would give if you're ever running an investigation would be a couple of weeks after the investigation's over, go back to the employee who complained and just follow up with them and just make sure that everything really is going okay. Because it shows the employee that you're still on it and you're still aware. And you don't know. Hopefully everything has been okay. No news is good news, but you can't always assume that no news is good news. And I think the employee would appreciate the follow-up as well. So
I think, hi, this is Ursula. I think in a case like this, it should go in their personnel file. And the reason I say that is if I observe this and I make a note and I keep it in my little file as suggested, another manager could observe the same behavior 2 weeks later and they're not aware it's an issue. So if it doesn't go in their personnel file, particularly in a company this big, I personally would see that as not really stepping up for this employee.
Yeah, and you know, that's a good point. And again, it probably, yeah, you know, because I did say derogatory slurs and he admitted to it. You know, it's one of those things that maybe the person who heard it thought it was derogatory. The person who said it didn't think it was derogatory. It's questionable. But I think you're right. If it's clearly a derogatory slur towards somebody because they're queer, it probably should go in the file, because if it does happen again, that's definitely a reason for taking some sort of adverse employment action if it doesn't stop. So yeah, that's a good point. I agree. Okay, and one more. You've got a female employee who comes to you and says, John, who's a coworker, keeps calling me honey and sweetie, and it's making me uncomfortable. Now, I don't think he means anything by it, and I don't want to cause trouble. I also don't want this to go any further. I'm just letting you know what's going on. And this happens a lot. What do you think? What do you do?
You got to deal with it.
Yeah.
Take that employee. So I didn't talk to him.
Does it matter that she says, I don't want this to go any further?
No, because they brought it to you.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, if they didn't want it to go any further, they wouldn't have brought it to you.
Probably.
Or you might not be able to, you can't just keep your mouth closed about it. You got to deal with it now because you're a supervisor and it's your obligation to try to make sure that things are going in the right direction.
Yeah. How do you think, how would you handle it? What would you do for a next step?
I would talk to them about maybe some different ideas that I would ask them if they would like to try to deal with them themselves and try to help talk out things that they could say the next time it happens, or how they could, if they wanted to try to diffuse it themselves, because a lot of times people can diffuse those situations when they actually can practice some simple little phrases to say, and then it'll stop. Probably 50% of the time when people come to me with a problem like this, they end up solving it themselves when we kind of talk it out, and they actually come back and say, nope, it's not a problem. I talked to them and they got it, and they understood what I was saying. But a lot of times people are afraid to say anything, so they're like that girl in the photo that you had earlier where she was very uncomfortable, but nobody dared say anything about it.
Mm-hmm.
So that's.
Now that's a good point. I think suggesting to her, you know, saying, are you comfortable talking to John about this?
Yeah.
And like you said, giving her maybe a couple of helpful hints of how she could address it with him herself, especially if she's saying, I don't want this to go any further, then you can kind of put it back on her a little bit and say, are you comfortable doing this? And she might say, you know what, that's a good idea. I've known John a long time. I should probably do that. And you don't know. John could be horrified that that's actually bothering her. He may have no idea.
And a lot of times asking someone a question is a good way of addressing their behavior. I don't know if this is exactly the thing, but a good example for it. But a lot of times I tell people, just ask someone a question about what they just said or did. You know, one guy just said, I want to talk about what you just said, or that did. The people know what they're doing, and they know enough about our expectations and our code of conduct that if someone just hints at their behavior and asks them a question about it, they'll all of a sudden turn around and say, you know what, that wasn't cool. I shouldn't have said that. I'm sorry. I know I shouldn't say those things.
Yep.
But so sometimes just asking a question, but if they do nothing at all, it's permission.
Yeah.
It's okay.
Yep. No, I like that question aspect.
Yep.
I think that's a good helpful hint.
Yeah, a couple of times I've gone to people and said, hey, I want to talk to you about what I heard you say to so-and-so out there in the yard. 90% of the time they say, I know, Mr. Dow. I know what you're going to say. And then they tell me everything that I was going to say. And they say, don't worry, it's not going to happen again. I'm not going to do it. I'm not going to do it. Because they don't want to have the conversation. And they already know. We've got a lot of people that understand. They've been here long enough. They're good people. All of our people that work here are good people. They got good hearts. And that's why they stay here. And so sometimes just that reminder helps them.
Right.
And they self-discipline very well when they're not in the defensive mode.
Yep.
Same
That's
thing,
a good point.
Same thing with, you know, when you accuse someone and start telling them what they did wrong, they're defensive. But when you ask them, hey, you know what? Do you think that was the right thing to say? Most of the time, if it wasn't, they'll tell you. But if you accuse them, they're going to be defensive, and then they're going to have to defend themselves. It's a natural thing.
Right.
So,
right.
Anyway.
I think in this situation too, you know, one of the closing pieces that I would say is to follow up with that female employee, put a little reminder on your calendar and follow up with her in a couple weeks and say, so did you have a chance to talk to John and see what she says? And, you know, because again, you're telling her that you care about her as an employee and you want to make sure that the behavior that's making her feel uncomfortable comes to an end. So the follow-up piece is really key. And it can slip through the cracks so easily when we get busy. I'm a big one for calendar reminders, just so that it doesn't slip through the cracks. Any other comments on this one?
I had one comment.
Yeah.
I think in this situation, I think it would be better if the female employee took care of it herself, you know, by us telling her, maybe giving her some things to say. Because if I were to go out there and talk to John and tell him, you know, hey, this isn't right, he might treat her a little different after that, thinking that, you know, oh, she ratted on me or snitched on me, type deal thing. You know, I mean, not in every situation, but I think this one here would be a good situation for her to kind of take care of it herself.
Yeah, I agree. And I would always encourage the employee to address it first with the offender, because I think that's just, like you said, that's otherwise it could be really taken the wrong way. That person ratted me out. They're out to get me in trouble. If it's something that can be resolved between the two of them, that's great. And again, as long as that follow-up piece is there so that you're making sure that it really has been resolved and it's not still hanging out there somewhere. But I would absolutely encourage that. Okay. So again, you know, just as a reminder that you're all managers and you're the ones that are setting that example. So you want to be modeling the behavior that you want your employees to be exhibiting, take the time to read the handbook from time when it does come out. And again, I'm not sure whether it's out yet or not, but when it does come out, really take the time to use it and to actually read through it and understand the different components. It's helpful because you can always refer to it. And sometimes it's helpful when you're dealing with an employee situation to be able to refer to what the handbook says about their behavior and how they're not exhibiting that behavior. You know, trust your instincts. If there's something going on out there and it's just not sitting right with you, chances are it's not okay. You got to trust your gut sometimes if it's something that isn't a real clear-cut situation. You never have to go it alone. You've always got somebody else that you can go to if you've got something going on and you're not really sure how to handle it. Again, we talked about diffusing active situations because I think you always want to bring the heat down in the moment if it's something that is escalating. And after that, you need to be addressing the inappropriate conduct quickly. Don't avoid it. And, you know, if you do get any kind of a report of harassing behavior, it is important to take it to the appropriate management team member. So I don't think that you have to go it alone. Ben, Matt, your senior managers, you should all know if there's a harassment complaint going on, you should know about it. And if anybody wants to chime in with who are the appropriate people to go to, be my guest. And again, you know, your behavior just needs to be reflecting the behavior that you are expecting of your own employees. So that brings us to the end. Do we have any other questions or comments on anything that was covered either today or anything that maybe came up since the previous sessions?
I had something just